Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series as we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Now, the two chapters we're reading today are Joshua 18 and 19. The actual date of this video is the 16th of July 2021. So if you're listening to this at a later date, the context today is our country in crisis, cities locked down, with rampant looting going on. And so what's needed right now is leadership, and not just leadership from our state president and the municipal leaders, but leadership from everybody on whom God puts a mantle of leadership. And so in your family, in your business, in your suburb, in your church, in the environment that God has put you in, when God gives you leadership, we to lead. Now, the spotlight here I would like to put on is the heart of the leader. So what happens in Joshua 18 is the whole assembly of Israel is gathered at Shiloh, and Joshua sets up the tent of meeting there, and he says, listen, we've taken a lot of territory, but there are still 7 tribes that do not have their land. And so what we want you to do is go and map the rest of the land. We're going to divide it up, and then I'm going to cast lots in the presence of God. And you're going to go and take the inheritance, take that which God has ordained for you. And so the first thing that happens is that the lot falls on Benjamin. Now we know the unique thing about Benjamin, he was the least of the tribes. Remember Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 9, Saul is trying to deflect the leadership role that God's giving him. And he says, why do you come to me? I'm the least of the tribes. God has this way of taking the least and pushing them to lead. I think it's because partly it requires a dependence on God. If you feel like you're the least being pushed in the front to lead. Some of you might be feeling that right now. I'm not qualified to say anything, do anything. God says, listen, I'm in the habit of taking the least and using them to lead. Anyway, so Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, they all get their inheritance. It's not plain sailing. Dan loses it. He has to, go and get it back again. And they settled in this place called Leshem. But in verse 49 it says, and when they'd finished dividing the land into portioned lots, the Israelites gave Joshua, son of Nun, an inheritance among them. Who was the very last to get his inheritance? Joshua, the captain. How different that is to worldly leadership, isn't it? It's almost like in a worldly secular context without God, that the higher you climb up a ladder, the more rights you have, the more you can demand your privileges. That is so not biblical. Paul put it this way when he talked about his apostleship. He says, we are at the end of the procession. Jesus, when he came to serve, he said, the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve. You know the old adage, the captain gets off the ship last? That's a noble maxim that's used in worldly circles, but its heart is in the Bible. That actually, as a leader, you're there to serve, and you're there to be lost. And so we see Joshua, not presuming to grab hold of things, but allowing the rest of his brothers to take. And then that's the heart of Jesus. Now, when Jesus spoke about leadership, he often did. And in Mark chapter 9, he has his disciples along a road, and they're arguing amongst who is the greatest. He says to them, what you talking about? And they were too embarrassed to say because they knew what they were talking about. And then he sits them down and he calls, this is verse 35 of Mark 9. And he calls them to him. And he says, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. He took a little child and placed them among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. What's Jesus saying? You don't clamor to be in front. Stand at the back. That's how we lead, and we prefer others. And so you say, well, God, how did Joshua manage to get this right? How did Joshua stay pure in his leadership role? Because power corrupts. We've seen it all over the place. Well, I think his life story tells you. One of the things that Joshua was always found was in the tent of meeting, in God's presence. When you're in God's presence, it humbles you. When you're in God's presence, you get your perspective right. And so leadership, having the right heart of leadership, starts by us being in God's presence. Secondly, he had courage. He was one of the spies that came back. He saw things through God's eyes, God on the throne. Now, when you are attempting to lead your communities, your family through this trying time we're in right now, it's got to be from the vantage point that God is supremely in command. He has not abdicated, and He's put a mantle of leadership on you, and He will guide you through. That's the approach. And he didn't grab for it. He didn't grab for it. His attitude was constantly, I know why you've called me here, Lord, to serve your people, to be in your presence. Stay humble. Keep serving God's people. Well, I trust that as you read these chapters and you meditate on that, you say, Lord, help me to play my role when a world is going mad, to lead in a way that represents Jesus.